today's World Insight with Jin Wei, Chinese and American top diplomats on a visit to Russia. What's on the agenda? And what does Confucian philosophy and old history tell us about the world's troubles today? A preeminent Chinese Confucian scholar enlightens us.
And you try to be public-spirited, not just a private ego, but also an open, dynamic, interchange person.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo traveled to Russia on Tuesday, where he met his counterpart Sergei Lavrov, along with Russian President Vladimir Putin for the near future. His trip to Russia follows his visit to Brussels, where he met European officials. In both visits, Iran is on the agenda. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Russia also coincides with Pompeo's trip there. As China's trade war with the U.S. takes a turn for the worse, and Russia struggles under U.S. sanctions, there may be more to the timing of this visit. Let's take a look.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo left Brussels for Russia on Tuesday. On the agenda during Pompeo's visit are U.S.-Russia arms control treaties, Iran, the DPRK, Syria, and the alleged Russian interference in U.S. elections. Pompeo's sit-down with Putin and Lavrov will be the highest-level face-to-face talks between Washington and Moscow since the release of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report on Russian meddling in the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
I'm here today because President Trump is committed to improving this relationship. As I think you said, we have differences. Each country will protect its own interests, look out for its own interests of its people. But it's not destined that we're adversaries on every issue, and I hope that we can find places where we have a set of overlapping interests and can truly begin to build out strong relationships, at least in those on those particular issues.
His visit coincides with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Russia on Monday. Wang Yi is on a mission to forge relations with Russia that's showing much greater signs of promise. Moscow rolled out the red carpet for China's top diplomat. The Chinese foreign minister went as far as saying the ties with Russia is so tight, it should be an example to the rest of the world.
We need to ramp up cooperation, comply with international commitments in terms of peace and security. And in this case, Russian and Chinese cooperation is a role model for the international community.
I'd like to support what my Chinese counterpart said on the importance of our nations to the future of the world. These are not just words. We need to take responsible action.
The meeting took place as China's trade deficit worsened, sending jitters to international markets. How can China and Russia work together to help ease turmoil in global markets? The Chinese State Consular and the U.S. Secretary of State visited Russia almost at the same time. Mere coincidence or diplomacy in action?
So, what do we make of the Chinese and American top diplomats' visits to Russia? Let's ask our panelists. In Arlington, Virginia, Ambassador William Courtney, he served as Special Assistant to the U.S. President and Senior Director of NSC staff for Russia. And also in Moscow, we invite Dmitry Barbich, political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency. In our Beijing studio, Mr. Cui Hongjian, the director of the Department for European Studies, Chinese Institute of International Studies. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. I want to start with you, Mr. Barbich. One after another, important visits by top diplomats from China and the U.S. What an interesting coincidence. Very briefly, your assessment of this coincidence and what's behind it, Mr. Barbich.
Well, it's indeed, first, it just shows you how wrong President Obama was when he said that Russia was isolated, that it was alone in the world. A country that is isolated cannot be hosting, the world's two top diplomats at the same time. So that is the first conclusion that I can make. If you ask me if I'm optimist or pessimist about these meetings, I'm very optimistic about the meeting of our foreign minister with the Chinese foreign minister Wang Yi, because it looks like we're seeing more and more eye to eye, and Russia and China are becoming basically a stabilizing force in international relations. Look where all the trade wars are coming from. They're not coming from Russia and China. They're coming from the United States. They're coming from the European Union. On the other hand, unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic about the meeting with Mr. Pompeo, because I can foresee now what Pompeo will be talking about. First, he will try to demonize China. He will try to tell Russia that China can be a threat. That will be dismissed, of course. And second, Mr. Pompeo will be suggesting various deals to Russia, like if Russia agrees that the United States would not deploy new missiles in Europe, would Russia agrees to the United States just leaving the INF treaty, because leaving the INF treaty is mostly directed against China. Just Mr. Trump and his team, they want to deploy more intermediate range missiles in Japan, in South Korea, in places next to China. So that will not be accepted by Russia. And in that sense, I'm pessimistic about Pompeo's visit. Pompeo is in general a very bad diplomat.
Let's go to Mr. Courtney. We have already a big opening by the Russian counterpart. Mr. Courtney, Ambassador, tell us about Mr. Pompeo's agenda as you see it in Russia. Of course, he said, according to the earlier quote we put in the backgrounder, that the two countries, meaning Moscow and Washington, do not have to be adversaries on every issue. And now he said, let's find this common ground. But how big is the common ground, Mr. Courtney?
There are a couple of important issues. The most important one, the most urgent one, is Iran. Iran, as you know, threatened to carry out retribution in response to the United States declaring the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps a state terrorist organization. Over the weekend, 4 ships around the Strait of Hormuz were damaged by some suspicious activity. It's not yet clear how that happened, but there are suspicions that Iran was behind it. The United States is sailing an aircraft carrier or moving other military assets there. So apparently the United States is concerned about potential military escalation in the Persian Gulf. That's important for Russia because Russia is allied with Iran in Syria, another area of concern to the United States. And then, as you know, China depends on the Persian Gulf for a lot of oil supplies. So this is an important issue for China as well. So I think it's at the top of the agenda. Second issue in urgency will be Venezuela. The International Monetary Fund predicts 10 million% inflation this year for Venezuela. It's clear that the Maduro government is not going to survive.
But Ambassador Courtney,
so
I still do not see
some cooperation with Russia on
but
Venezuela.
I still do not see, Ambassador Courtney, how would Moscow agree with Washington on its stances, both regarding Iran, which Washington withdrew from the JCPOA earlier agreed upon, and also about Venezuela, which Moscow made very clear, I guess, in the United Nations voting of the P5, where it stands. So if the Secretary of State is going there for common ground, exactly what he's talking about, or is he having wishful thinking, if thinking about these two issues? Ambassador Courtney, would you like to explain, or do we know the answer?
You're correct that America's goals with regard to Iran and Venezuela are ambitious goals. Russia has been closely tied to Iran for quite some time. On the other hand, it's probably in Russia's interest not to have a military conflagration happen regarding Iran in the Persian Gulf. So I think the United States will try to encourage Russia to encourage Iran to de-escalate the crisis there. With regard to Venezuela, Russia has an interest in long-term oil relationships with Venezuela, but for the time being, by supporting the Maduro regime, Russia is taking a risk that that regime will survive, and most likely it's not going to.
Mr. Cui, here in Beijing, I want to ask you the question on both sides. One is, of course, your comments about how much common ground, as you see it as a Chinese scholar, is there for Washington and Moscow on some of these important issues, whether it's Iran, Venezuela, DPRK, Afghanistan, Syria, you name it, including with arms control as well. Secondly, of course, as a Chinese scholar, would also like to ask you about how much common ground is China having with Russia, despite the fact of this very proactive visit by the U.S. Secretary of State to Moscow. Mr. Cui, I'm sorry it's a prolonged question, but go ahead, sir.
Thank you for the question. I think for this first question, I agree with the ambassador from America said that, okay, there are a lot of the maybe common issues, but I don't think it should be a common ground between Russia and the United States. If we just take account of the issue, just like Mr. Pompeo mentioned before his visit to Moscow, including the Iran and also the Venezuela and the Korea Peninsula, everything indeed, or mostly we can find out there are a lot of very, very big differences on stands between United States and Russia. And another issue is, yes, I think now there is a very interesting situation now. These three major players, China, Russia, and the United States, it looks like it has a very frequent, exchanges in Moscow recently. It shows that mostly now it's a very, very critical time for the global, strategical balance, especially as we know, after so many issues or tensions and created by American government in Persian Gulf, in the, as we know, this trade friction between China and the United States, and even this armament issue. So I think now it shows the purpose from American administration to try to, stop a trend that maybe for more and more collaboration between China and Russia, and also yes, it also shows the Chinese effort to strengthen its collaboration with Russia to keep the strategic balance on the global level.
Right. So, Mr. Barbish, if I can ask your advice, is there anything that Moscow would like to work with the United States, even though given the fact that both sides knows very well where the other side stands right now? Is there still delicate common ground that can be sought if Washington is proactive in its attitude in pursuing them? Mr. Barbish.
Well, of course, there are lots of areas where Russia would love to cooperate with the United States, and that was our position since the mid-80s, I would say, since Mr. Gorbachev came to power. Actually, our policy was pretty consistent. We were actually very optimistic about our relations with the United States and especially with Europe, especially in the 90s. And that policy never stopped, despite what you hear from the Western media. But the problem is that, you ask me about every issue, and I give you facts how the United States is simply destroying all chances of cooperation. As our interlocutor in the United States, Mr. Courtney, rightly said, the United States is preparing, obviously, for a war in Iran. And of course, it would be very strange if Iran, being a much weaker state than the United States, would attack U.S. interests there. It's obvious that it's the United States that has been on offensive in the Middle East. And Iran is not a supporter of international terrorism. Quite on the contrary, despite my dislike for the theocratic regime in Iran, for the mullahs, still Iran was a victim of Al-Qaeda's attack many times in the last at least 10 years.
So you are saying,
Venezuela,
Mr.
our
Barbish,
interlocutor in Washington, raised that issue, but I will just quickly finish. I promise it will be interesting for you. Okay.
Go ahead, sir.
It will be interesting because Venezuela is a classical example. With Venezuela, it's not only Russia. Russia and China are basically protesting against the regime change in Venezuela. we may not be in raptures about the government of Mr. Maduro, but the fact that the United States openly tried to topple him. Last week, it was reported in the American press there was a coup attempt, you know, against the government there. That is, of course, unacceptable for Russia and China, not because we're allies, we're not yet allies, but because we are conscientious members of international community, and we don't want governments being toppled from outside. That's as simple as that. That makes Russia and China allies.
But if I could follow up on that, Mr. Barbish, and a brief answer from you too, if you can. So you are suggesting that fundamentally the stances between Moscow and Washington are different on all of these very crucial issues, and you do not see, from your perspective, this trip made by the Secretary of State of the U.S. would change in any way the nature of these different opinions between the two countries. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, exactly. And it's not only towards Russia that Mr. Pompeo is behaving very intolerantly. Just 2 days ago, he called the position of the main British opposition politician, Jeremy Corbyn, his position on Venezuela. Mr. Pompeo called it, I quote, disgusting. Disgusting simply because Mr. Corbyn was against regime change in Venezuela. So if Mr. Pompeo is so intolerant with his allies, the UK is the main ally of the United States, then what do you expect from him towards his opponents? Russia and China are opponents. So I think that, you know, both Russia and the United States are interested in fighting terrorism, in stabilizing Latin America, but the problem is that the United States is pursuing such kind of change, both in the Middle East and in Latin America, that it simply makes this stabilization impossible. You know, you can't have revolution and stabilization at the same time. You have
All
to
right,
choose
you got
something.
your point already. Ambassador Courtney, give you airtime too. Given the fact that what your Russian colleague just said, that there are sea differences in the fundamental belief about how these issues can be handled, why Secretary Pompeo had this wishful thinking, or he just did not know how to measure the real thoughts of the other side when he's making these trips and try to provide the other parties? Is he, according to his agenda, wasting his time? And why would he like to waste his time, quote unquote?
So in diplomacy, countries have interests, and they have to prioritize those interests. Mr. Babich is correct that there are a lot of differences between the United States and Russia, but both countries have their own priorities. Russia's main problem is that it is politically and economically weak. America's main problem is it is trying to pursue a go-it-alone foreign policy in which allies in Europe are not fully on board, and the U.S. is trying to pressure too many countries at one time. So both countries are going to have to do some prioritization. Take Venezuela, for example. China is pursuing a more careful and quiet course in Venezuela, whereas Russia has pursued a more high-profile course. My sense is there that Venezuela is not critically important for Russia. That's an area where eventually it's possible for cooperation for the United States and Russia to work together to facilitate a transition. May not happen, but it's possible. The most urgent issue, though, is preventing a conflict, a war in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf area involving Iran. I think both the United States are in that. There's probably going to be some cooperation, and China, of course, has an interest in that as well because of its dependence on Persian Gulf oil supplies. So diplomacy can achieve real objectives, even if the sides don't agree on many issues.
But the question really is, Mr. Cui, apparently Russia and China, according to the official statements, both believe it was Washington that screwed up the whole issues, for example, about Iran, by withdrawing from JCPOA to begin with, and in Venezuela, as Mr. Barbish put it, as pursuing regime change, which the two countries do not fundamentally agree at all from the very beginning. That has always been the political stances of these two countries, China and Russia, no regime change. So if that were the case, it seems that this is a very interesting trip made by the U.S. Secretary of State. So I wouldn't suggest that the Secretary of State is not a smart guy. He must be. So the question is really why, despite of little hope that the other sides might change their positions, I mean China and Russia, the Secretary of State still wanted to make that trip. Does it mean the crisis were already to the edge of a overblown situation that he had to make that trip? Or he made that trip in the name of these issues, but actually trying to discuss other issues, which he might not be able to put into his agenda showing to the public. So these are interesting questions, isn't it, Mr. Cui?
Yes, indeed. Firstly, we can find out I think, very big differences even from this discussion between our two guests, I mean, from Russia and from Washington. But now I think this, the sense of the trip by Mr. Pompeo to Moscow now is, I think, maybe some logic behind this behavior, just like the American ambassador mentioned that now it's a posture posted by United States to give a signal to Moscow, say that, okay, maybe now you are weak. So just give me some cooperation, or even I give you some compromise. It would be very good opportunity for Russia to go back into maybe the center of I mean, international arena like that. And also at the same time, I think that the major purpose for this visit by Mr. Pompeo to try to stop any kind of a fight back for any, kind of offensive, posture or position by United States in the past. So I think, yes, now the question is, Russia will not be so naive to believe that, okay, this time I just give you an opportunity, I just say some maybe more positive words towards Washington. It shows that, yes, I come back, and yes, I will believe everything. But now the question is, now American administration is losing its credibility on so many regional and global issues.
Okay, Mr. Courtney, I need to go to you just to balance the conversation. There might also be issue about China on the agenda of Secretary Pompeo, as he's been traveling around the world and saying not necessarily positive things about China on the public record. So knowing what China and Russia, where the two countries are in terms of its relations with one another, how much Secretary Pompeo or the United States can seek its opportunity in having a relatively satisfying relationship as Washington sees it with the two countries? Ambassador Courtney.
Again, there have to be priorities in diplomacy. So on the one hand, the United States is probably seeking to work with Russia and China to avoid conflict in the Persian Gulf area. That's an urgent need. On the other hand, there are some people who are hardliners in the United States who believe the United States should try to split Russia and China. That's unrealistic. China and Russia have cooperated more closely since the West imposed sanctions on Russia and since the United States is engaged in a trade war with China. So there's no real incentive for China and Russia to separate their positions now to go further apart because the U.S. wants them to do that. Right now, we really have to focus, all of the great powers have to focus on preventing conflict in the Persian Gulf and then trying to cooperate in some other areas. Syria is a great example. Russia does not have the economic resources to do economic reconstruction in Syria, and a lot of that country is destroyed. Russia's asking Europe to finance that. But Europe will not do that with Iran providing security on the ground. So there are areas for cooperation in Syria, too.
Well, there are a lot of issues certainly on the agenda. Whether they will be able to have some consensus, that's a big question mark. And I want to thank the insights from the three of you gentlemen for being with us. William Courtney, Dmitry Barbish from Russia, and Cui Hongjian from China. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the three of you. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. What does Confucian philosophy and old history tell us about world's troubles today? A preeminent Chinese Confucian scholar enlightens us right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. With the international trading order in tatters, the debate over globalization is front and center. To make heads and tails of the uncertainty and looming conflict, let's look at it through the prism of philosophy and history, if we can. Back in China's Warring States period of time before the Qin dynasty, all sorts of thoughts and leadership battles for dominance. Confucianism, then, was the idea whose time has come. Fast forward to modern times, in a way more complex world, could ancient Chinese philosophy help shed some light? As the Conference on Dialogue of Civilization is going to take place in Beijing on Wednesday, let's hear out Professor Tu Weiming, one of the most respected Chinese Confucian thinkers for a long time. When it comes to comparing Chinese philosophy with Western ideas, Professor Tu is a real scholar of knowledge on China as an ancient living civilization. Let's listen in.
I'm suggesting that the current chaos, as compared with the Warring States period, magnified by 1,000 times, global disorder, not to mention the climate change, the environmental degradation, and now the incredible development of science, which may lead to the whole question of redefining humanity. So all these are major chaotic forces, and the diversity is even greater. The technologies, especially in science and communication, has enabled the global community to become a global village. And this is, in a way, our misfortune, because the village is noted for tension, conflict, and contradiction, but it is also the great fortune for the humans to think for the first time in human history as a community.
But here comes the question, Professor Tu.
Yes.
That is, China has already become the second largest economy in the world.
Right.
At least in the number.
Right.
Secondly, people are looking at China and say, what can you offer?
Right.
Besides money.
Right.
Cash.
Right.
Infrastructure.
Right.
What about ideas?
Right. Very deep in my heart, and in terms of my own self-reflection, it's not simply arrogance or simply wishful thinking. I do believe within Chinese culture, within especially the spiritual aspects of Chinese culture, there are a lot of resources that can very well be mobilized and enhance our understanding of the human. For example, one of the ideas in the Confucian tradition is that from the emperor to the commoner, each should regard self-cultivation as the root. The idea of self-cultivation is each human being, despite ethnicity, gender, and so forth, ought to first ask the question introspectively. How can I be a reasonable human being? How can I be friendly to others? This idea of self-improvement, self-understanding, starting from each individual, is a rich resource for the human community.
We are not seeing many of the great examples of so-called self-cultivation, as you just mentioned. So people would say, Professor, probably your thought is out of date.
It's still happening. The exceptional case indicates how precious this idea, it is not just Confucian, it is in the Christian, in the Islamic, in Hindu, all the traditions. If you want to understand yourself, you should first of all very serious about self-cultivation, about self-reflection. This is a resource that every human being has. It is not that going to be demonstrated by the leaders. Many of the leaders seem to have lost their way, and because they become political animals. They are no longer human in the genuine sense of the term. And so this is only part of the story. The other one is how to deal with another person. The principle of do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. It's a golden rule in the negative, is to say the minimum requirement for human interaction is to see to it the other receive not only your recognition but your respect. and you try to be public-spirited, not just a privatized ego, but also an open, dynamic, interchange person. So I think in a way that is, despite the challenge you just mentioned, I think it's real, it's very serious, and self-cultivation as a way of life is very widely accepted.
Professor Chu, as you may know, these days when people talk about China or the Chinese in general, they are saying, oh, these are smart people.
Right.
They're getting richer. And it seems that in a few decades, they're going to leave all of us behind. Well, they are going to be the group that's going to benefit the development of the world. And that is interesting phenomenon because you've been advocating, Professor Chu, self-cultivation, which in certain cases could mean the communications are not efficient.
Right.
Because people tend to look inside, more self-cultivation, rather than increase the capability of communicating with others of exactly what your egos and your desires are.
Yes.
And that could lead to miscommunication, misunderstanding, and probably even bigger problems. How do you see the balance of these two?
Actually, a person is always understood as a center of relationships. It's not possible to think about a person as an isolated individual. It's not an island. So subjectivity in this connection is also intersubjectivity, your ability to think in terms of the others. The others becomes not only recognized, respected, but the dignity of the other is an end in itself rather than just a means to an end. So reciprocity in the classical sense of the term is even among family members, the father, son, husband and wife, and older and younger siblings, the relationship is always reciprocal because you have to exercise the value of considerateness. If you do not do that, that will haunt you.
Right.
And you will not be able to really sustain with your own one-dimensional approach to express your egoistic concerns. It's not your private person, but how you understand yourself as a relationship in reference to many other people with many other aspirations.
But this is what also people have been talking about.
Yes.
These days, it's not about who is having the dignity, who is having this moral high ground, but rather who is going to be the winner.
This, of course, Hobbes' idea, all human beings are involved in a kind of zero-sum game, is very common. And this is going to continue. But there are underlying rules that allow even this level of communication to happen.
Like
Otherwise,
what?
there's no communication.
Like
now,
what?
I have to say, even though we're not in a dialogical civilization, we're in a conflictual civilization, but the word dialogue actually occurs all the time, at all levels, for any society to survive, not to mention the global community. Certain kind of rules of the game, certain kind of etiquette, certain kind of consideration will have to be there in order for the world to continue. Otherwise, there's no even communication possible, let alone dialogue.
Professor Tu Weiming was born in Kunming, Yunnan province in the 1940s. He grew up in Taiwan and later he studied and taught in several world-renowned institutes in the U.S. Almost a decade ago, he came back to the Chinese mainland where he's been doing humanistic research based on his vast experience at home and abroad. And from an insider and an outsider's perspective, what can be learned from China's experience over the past few decades? China getting richer and China getting much more respected than it used to be. But at the same time, there are daunting tasks in front of China.
Yes.
Still, probably even more. As they say, the reform has been going into the so-called deep water zone.
Right.
Is there something from China's ancient philosophy or its modern version will be able to help lead the way?
Absolutely. I think one very important idea is that China, in terms of collectively, Chinese economy is the second. But per capita, the Chinese situation is still quite miserable. And probably 100 million people are still classified as abject poverty. So how China would develop, first of all, a sense of equity, a sense of mutual responsibility. Each person's dignity has to be respected, and the people who are poor will have to be helped. And because the gap between the rich and poor in China is very serious, 10%, 90% or so.
Yeah.
And it is in this situation that China need to rethink the 5 basic values within its own tradition.
Like what?
The first one is a sense of humanity, a sense of human-heartedness, sympathy, empathy. The other one is justice, not just freedom, but also justice. And of course, civility. Civility, which is really lacking, sometimes even in ordinary human existence. And wisdom, not just accumulation of knowledge, but also wisdom and the idea to reflect about oneself all the time. And very important feature is trust. And we really, as compared with, say, Japan, with Europe, and the trust is quite deficient in China. This kind of spiritual, ethical resources are absolutely critical for sustaining not just wealth and power, but also basic equality and even basic peace and stability. And that people basically agree. The ideas that you teach your children, and hopefully your children will be able to put them into practice, are really the ideas that we need to ask Chinese parents, Chinese leaders, Chinese entrepreneurs, successful Chinese to think about them.
But many say, Professor,
yes,
there's a fine balance between the vitality of social debates
right,
and the stability and efficiency
yes,
of a society.
Right.
How is that being reflected in today's China? What is that fine balance?
Right. I think there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of discussion through the internet, through which are and all kinds of other facilities. But that's not public debate. Basically, reaction to a particular incident, to a particular situation that people don't like, and there's a great deal of uproar, and there's an upsurge of certain kind of anger, frustration, and this is not debate. How do we channel that mechanism? The mechanism is there, and allowing reasonable ideas to be expressed. Not only allowing reasonable ideas to be expressed, allowing certain kind of critical spirit to be cultivated. This critical spirit, self-cultivation actually means you'll be able to criticize yourself. It's very important not to develop a certain kind of self-congratulatory notion about your greatness because you certainly feel that you're rich enough to be able to outsmart others. And this is the idea of humbleness, humility. Is very, very critical for the Chinese community as a whole.
Professor Tu, before we go, several important words that I would like to share with you. For example, confidence. How confidence is being built, reflected, but at the same time make sure it is not going to become a force of self-satisfaction. Confidence and humbleness.
Right.
This right balance.
Right. Confidence and arrogance are really in conflict. Confidence is based upon inner strength. And again, I return to the idea of cultivation. The cultivation is a way of understanding who I am. And even though I fail to perform well in some other areas, but there's always the possibility of recharge the energy. But also recognize this is not my privilege. This is my responsibility. Many other people deserve the same kind of respect. And therefore, how you'll be able to learn the best from all over the world, at the same time you have some confidence that your direction is correct. These two are interconnected. If they are separate, then you lose not only your own confidence, but also your ability to continue to learn and relearn.
In Confucianism,
Right.
One of the most important thing is to make sure that people aspire to become a noble person.
Right.
君子. Now, today's world, what are some of the most important qualities if you call someone a 君子, a noble person, or a people, a noble people?
And first of all, it's a sense of a person with dignity. Commander of the 3 armies can be snatched away. The will of a commander cannot be snatched away. If you will that no matter at what kind of political or social stratification, you want to be a person that you feel not only comfortable with, but proud. And you want to be the best kind of person you want to become. This is the idea of learning to be human. And to Lu Xiangsan talk about to establish that which is great in us. Every human being, man, woman, old and young and so forth, all have the will that I want to be a better human being. And I want to be a better human being not as an isolated individual. It's against extreme form individualism. I want to be a human being because I can communicate fruitfully, meaningfully to other human beings.
Yes.
And we can grow and flourish together.
Professor Tu, what a pleasure talking to you. I learned so much today. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Really
I
appreciate it.
Yeah.
谢谢. Professor Tu Weiming, one of the best-known scholars in the world about Confucianism. A lot of what he said really are food for thought for people today. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight, CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.